I never should have come to the Isle of Skye. I knew it the moment I stepped off the ferry. The sharp scent of the sea, the cold wind whispering in my direction as if trying to warn me. But it was too late. Now, trapped between fog-shrouded mountains and jagged cliffs that drop straight into the sea, I feel the weight of the island's history crushing me. I came here looking for peace, an escape from crowded cities, the constant pressure of work, the endless honking of cars and glaring city lights. I wanted solitude, silence, but all I found is an oppressive feeling of being watched. Not by the island's inhabitants. They're quiet, distant, maybe even suspicious of outsiders. But by something else, something I can't explain. The first few days were unsettling but manageable. I stayed in a cottage near the village of Portree, surrounded by mountains and lush fields. People say Portree is the heart of the Isle of Skye, with its colorful houses lining the bay, but I didn't feel life there. Something in the air was thick, almost tangible. The local markets, where fishermen brought in whatever the sea offered, were always filled with murmured conversations and furtive glances. All the while, I felt like an intruder. And perhaps, in some way, I was. Skye, nestled in the highlands of Scotland, bears a heavy history. It's said that many lost souls still wander its misty fields and rocky hills. I heard stories of bloody battles, of ancient clans who waged endless wars, their souls never finding rest. But what truly captured my attention was the legend of Cailleach, the old goddess of winter, known to the islanders as a dark figure who haunts the hills, guiding the winds that carry death. It was foolish, I thought, just an old story, nothing more. But then, the nights began to stretch on. Round 2 in the morning, I would wake to the sound of the wind, howling fiercely through the cracks of the cottage. I knew storms were common here, but there was something different that night. The sound wasn't just the wind against the windows. It was as if someone was whispering outside. Headed to the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, beyond the cottage, on the distant hills, a figure. Tall, hunched, it stood like a shadow against the night. I stood there, frozen, waiting for my eyes to betray me, hoping it was just a tree or a rock poorly lit by the moon. But it wasn't. I knew what I was seeing. And then, in an instant, it vanished into the darkness. The next day, I went to the local shop to buy supplies. I remember the woman behind the counter giving me a look I couldn't quite understand at the time. She knew. Everyone on this island knew. I was the only fool who refused to believe the stories. I asked her about the hills, about Cailleach, but she just looked at me with tired eyes and muttered something in Gaelic before turning away. Her message was clear. Don't go there. Ignoring the warning, I ventured to the Old Man of Store, the most famous rock formation on the island, thinking that perhaps by exploring more, my mind would calm down. But when I got there, it felt like the stones were alive. No, not alive in the literal sense, but something in them pulsed. The clouds hung low, enveloping the mountain tops, and the wind seemed to carry whispers to my ears. I heard my name. I ran. I don't know what drove me to run so fast, but I didn't stop until I was back at the cottage. Sweat poured down my face, my heart pounded in my chest, and part of me thought maybe I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was following me, something I couldn't understand. That night, I woke again. The figure was closer this time, standing just beyond the field behind the cottage. The dark outline was more defined now, and I could see its arms stretched out, almost as if beckoning me. My body was rigid with terror. I closed all the curtains, curled up on the couch, and stayed there, waiting for daylight. I couldn't stay on the island any longer. I decided that the next morning, I would leave. But what I didn't know was that once you see Cailleach, there's no escape. The curse is sealed. When I went to the port to catch the ferry, the fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. The boat was there, but the sailor refused to take me. He just looked at me with an expression of pity and resignation. He knew. I pleaded, offered more money, but he shook his head, murmuring something about being marked. I returned to the cottage, hope draining from me. That night, for the last time, I looked out the window. She was there, now only a few feet from the door, her skeletal figure draped in tattered cloths, her head tilted as if patiently waiting. Darkness seemed to swallow the cottage whole. The last thing I remember was the sound of the wind and a whisper, my name. And now I'm here, trapped in the eternal mist of sky, between the hills and the icy sea. They don't speak of us, the ones who were marked. But we're here, wandering with the fog, lost between legend and reality. And one day, someone like you will come to the island, seeking peace or an escape from the mundane. But all you'll find is Kalich's call. And like me, you will never leave this island.
I've always needed proof to believe in anything. I'm not superstitious, just skeptical. When I chose Pavaglia Island in Croatia for my vacation, it was purely for its exotic charm. Deserted beaches, ancient ruins, and a safe distance from the crowds of tourists. But the moment I mentioned my choice in Dubrovnik, the locals' tone changed. Pavaglia is not a place for tourists, they said, but I laughed, brushing off their warnings as old-fashioned tales. Pavaglia Island's history is dark. In the past centuries, it was used as a quarantine for people infected with the bubonic plague. It's said that over 160,000 bodies were discarded there, cremated in piles of ashes that can still be found beneath the soil. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Pavaglia became a place to isolate the mentally ill. The asylum that operated on the island gained a reputation for its abusive practices and gruesome experiments carried out by a doctor who, according to legend, eventually threw himself from the hospital tower after being tormented by the ghosts of his victims. This was where I found myself, the perfect destination for someone looking for relaxation, at least in my skeptical mind. After all, they were just stories, I thought. No real evidence. I was here for the sun and warmth, and I wasn't going to let myths rattle me. When I arrived at the island, I disembarked on a small wooden dock, surrounded by the turquoise waters of the Adriatic. The view was breathtaking. Dense vegetation, the old asylum's ruins on a hilltop, and a deserted beach that looked like a hidden paradise. Everything was so calm and serene that the horror stories seemed impossible. I saw no reason to worry, and with that thought, I began my exploration. The first signs of discomfort came when I entered the asylum ruins. The dark, abandoned corridors still retained the eerie energy of their operational days. But of course, in my mind, it was just an overactive imagination. The shadows on the walls weren't ghosts, but the natural result of sunlight filtering through broken windows. The heavy silence was simply the sound of absence, not the echo of lost souls. And the smell, likely the result of decades of decay and rot. I kept walking through the corridors. The walls were covered in graffiti and strange symbols, a mix of Latin and what seemed like an old Slavic dialect. I delved deeper into the asylum's basement, where old, rusted medical instruments were still scattered across iron gurneys. There were claw marks on the walls and dark stains on the floors, long dried. The air was thick, and I felt a pressure in my ears that made me lose balance for a moment. But I didn't let it shake me. The place is just older than it seems, I thought. It's just the effects of suggestion. And by late afternoon, as the sun began to sink below the horizon, everything started to change. I was still inside the main building when I first heard it, a distant sound. A moan like someone in pain, echoing through the empty corridors. I froze in place, my muscles locked for a moment. And yet I convinced myself it was just a trick of my mind. No one else was on the island but me. What I heard was nothing more than echoes of history, mixed with the wind. But the sounds persisted, growing closer, clearer. They weren't solitary moans anymore. They were screams of terror, pain, and agony. Curiosity outweighed fear, and I moved toward the sound. I descended another level in the building, reaching an iron door that seemed sealed by years of rust. With some effort, I managed to open it. As I pushed the door, I was greeted by a cold, damp room that reeked of rust and decay. In the middle of the room, what appeared to be an old autopsy table stood, stained marble, torn curtains, and medical instruments scattered. But what truly terrified me was the sight in the corner. A pile of human bones, deliberately arranged, almost ritualistically. It was clear these bones weren't ancient. Some still had bits of decaying flesh clinging to them. For a second, my rational mind tried to convince me that this could be the work of vandals or cultists. But I could no longer deny the reality. Something far darker was at work on this island. I turned to leave, but in the hallway, figures appeared. In distinct forms, dressed in white like patients from old asylums. Faceless, just shadowy human shapes that slowly moved toward me. Panic gripped me as I tried to flee. I ran through the ruins, but no matter where I went, the screams and moans followed me. The island seemed alive with the pain of thousands of trapped souls, and I was their next target. In a moment of complete desperation, I found an exit outside and sprinted toward the beach. The sun was almost completely below the horizon now, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. The figures were getting closer, and my breathing became increasingly labored as if the air was slowly being drained around me. I ran to the water, as if I could escape by swimming. But just before diving in, I felt invisible hands grab me, dragging me back onto the sand. In my final moments, lying on my back on the beach as the shadows closed in, my mind tried to search for some rational explanation. But I knew, finally, that the skepticism that had always protected me had condemned me. Poveglia wasn't just an island with a dark history. It was a place where death and madness coexisted, and I, in my pride and disbelief, had walked into the ultimate trap. My last memories before total darkness were of the calm waters and starry sky above, cruelly contrasting with the terror that gripped me. My final thoughts were a cold, bitter regret. If only I had heeded the warnings.
All started with a letter, not a modern one, no email or text message, but a real letter, handwritten on old yellow paper. The envelope had no return address, and the words inside were brief, direct. She awaits you. Come to Ustica. No signature. It didn't make any sense. I didn't know anyone on the island of Ustica, and I had never even heard of it before, but something about those words deeply unsettled me. It felt as if they were written specifically for me, as if they knew that behind my ordinary life, I had always been waiting for something beyond the mundane, beyond logical explanation. Maybe it was the sense that something was missing in my life that led me to buy the ticket and leave. I wasn't seeking adventure, nor was I looking for answers. I felt a strange call, something I couldn't explain, but that became impossible to ignore. When I arrived in Ustica, the air was different, heavy, and though the sea was crystal clear during the day, it seemed to hide dark secrets just below the surface. No one was at the small port to meet me, but that didn't bother me. I walked along the winding road to the village center, where I found a modest inn and settled in. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I had to stay. The first few days on the island were peaceful. The locals, while reserved, seemed accustomed to the occasional visitor. I wandered through narrow streets lined with stone houses and walked down to the harbor at sunset, feeling an unsettling familiarity, as if I had been there before. But one night something changed. I was returning from the market when I saw for the first time the figure. It was standing next to a tree, its back turned to me, near the edge of the path that led to the cliffs. It seemed to be waiting for me. My heart raced, and I hesitated, but before I could approach, the figure vanished into the darkness. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen, maybe because I didn't know what to think, but from that night on, I started to notice something strange within me. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was in the room. But when I turned on the lights, no one was there. Other times, I found small cuts on my skin, as if something had marked me while I slept. The visions became more frequent, always at a distance, always fleeting. A shadow out of the corner of my eye, a figure watching me from afar. I knew I wasn't alone, but no one else seemed to notice what was happening. Only I did. Then, one afternoon, I decided to follow the trails leading inland. I walked for hours until I came to a place that wasn't on the maps. An old, abandoned cemetery hidden among the trees and moss. The atmosphere there was suffocating, the silence absolute. The gravestones were covered in lichen, their names erased by time. But one gravestone, in particular, stood out. It was new, clean, and most disturbingly, it had my name engraved on it. That was the moment something inside me broke. I fell to my knees, trying to understand what it meant. Was it a warning? A cruel joke? I no longer knew if I was alive or dead, if this was a nightmare or if everything was real. In the days that followed, the shadows around me grew. I began avoiding the streets, the markets. Even daylight seemed harsh. I locked myself in the inn, the curtains always closed, waiting for something I couldn't name. Then, one night, the letter appeared again. On the same old paper, the same words. She awaits you. Come to Ustica. But this time, below the phrase, there was another line. Your time is running out. I knew then that I had to return to the cemetery. Perhaps it was madness, perhaps it was something beyond my control, but I knew I had to go. That night, under a pale moon, I walked there alone with the cold wind whispering in my ears. When I arrived, she was there, the figure I had seen by the cliffs. She was no longer a vague shadow, but a woman with long black hair, dressed in old, worn garments, like someone from another time. She didn't speak but held out her hand to me. I approached, hesitant, my heart pounding. When I touched her hand, a wave of memories crashed over me, fragments of a life I didn't recognize but felt deeply as my own. The life I had lived before now on this very island, a cycle that repeated endlessly. I understood then that I had been here before, and that I always came back. But the woman herself, trapped in a time that never moved forward, offered me a silent choice. I'd leave, but with the certainty that someday, the island would call me back. Or I could stay, accept my fate, and vanish among the shadows like so many before me. The darkness began closing in around me, and for a moment I was caught between two worlds, one real and one ethereal. When I closed my eyes, I felt the cold touch of her hand fade away. When I opened them, I was alone in the cemetery. The gravestone with my name was gone, as if it had never been there. I returned to the village in silence, not knowing what awaited me. But one thing was clear. I was still here, and the island, whatever its curse, still allowed me to walk its streets. I left Ustica the next day, without looking back, but the feeling that something followed me has never completely gone away. Sometimes, on the quietest days, when I'm alone, I feel the same chill in the air, the same whisper in the shadows. I left the island, or at least, I think I did, but Ustica, I know, never truly let me go. And I'll never know if, one day, the call will come again.